Our first question comes from Lisa Wheeler tonight, please. Lisa.
Following Jared O'Mara's rightful suspension by the Labour Party, is a public figure allowed a pass?
Is a public figure allowed a pass? Jacob Rees Mogg.
Not by me.
Well, I agree with a lot of what's been said before. I think Mr O'Mara is entitled to due process. I think that politicians are allowed to have done things in their youth that they wouldn't wish to repeat now. But there must be limits, that there must be some things that we feel are so beyond the pale and so indicative of a political belief that they become inexcusable. And I would go further. I think we should be really worried as a society with online abuse. And this is a particular problem for female MPs. They get a level of abuse that as a male MP I don't get, and I'm not entirely free from controversy from time to time, but I simply do not get it. But people like Jess Phillips, who is a friend of mine, is appallingly treated. She gets death threats, she gets hate words addressed at her on Twitter. And so I think somebody who is involved with that is doing something that is very corrosive to society. And society needs to look at itself and think, how are we putting up with this and how are we going to stop it? Because if we don't stop it, it will deter very good people from taking up high-profile roles.
Okay. Go on. I'll take our second question, Zahid Khan, please. Zahid Khan.
As Raqqa is recaptured and freed from ISIS, people who travel from UK to fight for ISIS will be looking to return. Should they be allowed back?
All right, well, Jacob Rees Mogg, you start on this because it was a member of your party who made remarks about this that were widely reported.
It was Rory Stewart who made remarks about this. Again, I think people are entitled to due process. I believe that one of the fundamental freedoms that we have as Britons is that we have a rule of law and that we are innocent until proved guilty. And that should always apply. I think it's wrong to say that people are guilty before you've got evidence.
Rory Stewart said, let me just quote him, that IS fighters are a serious danger to us. Unfortunately, the only way of dealing with them will be, in almost every case, to kill them.
Look, I'm not in favour of capital punishment, and I'm certainly not in favour of the state taking life without due process. That if you are at war, people get killed, but we are not going to be fighting with these people on a battlefield. To take them out using special services, I think, would be illegal under UK and international law. But we must make sure that they are properly vetted when they get back. We must make sure that they have if they have committed crimes, that they are given very long sentences. And if necessary, we must hold them until we've had a chance to investigate, which I would not normally be in favour of, but I think you can make a reasonable guess that if you've gone out to fight for ISIS, you are a fairly undesirable person.
You mean hold them indefinitely?
Not indefinitely. Hold them for a limited time to try and gather evidence so that you can then bring them to trial. I think it is a reasonable assumption that most people who have gone out there are likely to have committed crimes whilst they're out there, but a reasonable assumption should not deprive somebody of their liberty forever.
Jacob,
just the last one. Just two thoughts. One is that if we lower ourselves to the level of ISIS, we destroy our own values more effectively than they can do it to us. And the second is that we actively want to get them back and lock them up. I agree with Baroness Chakrabarti that we need to have them in British prisons so they are out of the ability to commit any harm on the rest of us. Well, they are at our expense because they're British to start with, and therefore to some extent it is our responsibility. But our country will be safer if these people are in prison. And I want to see them locked up for the crimes that they have committed.
We'll go on. Just, have you had words with your Foreign Office Minister about what he said about killing ISIS?
I haven't spoken to him recently, no.
What would you say to him if you came across him?
Well, we might talk about the weather, you never know, but I haven't discussed it with him. I don't share his view. I don't think the right approach is for the British government to break our own law.
OK. But I want to go on to a question from Sheena Brown, please. Sheena Brown.
Should Mark Carney and the BBC admit Brexit will happen and get behind Britain instead of deprecating our nation and continually weakening our bargaining stance.
Well, that admonition, of course, comes from something that Jacob Rees Mogg himself said this week when he called Mark Carney one of the enemies of Brexit. He's opposed it consistently and called the BBC the Brexit-bashing corporation. Jacob Rees Mogg.
Thank you. Well, first of all, why I have criticised the Governor of the Bank of England and continue to do so is that during the Brexit referendum, he made the bank's views of Brexit clear in a way that he never does in a general election. He didn't give his view earlier this year on what Mr Corbyn's economic plans would do to the United Kingdom, but he did express a view on Brexit. That seemed to me to politicise the Bank of England and to besmirch its reputation. We trust the Bank of England to be apolitical, to be independent, not to be the creature of whoever happens to be Chancellor.
What was it he said that particularly offended you? I mean, he said the risks of a leave vote could possibly include a technical recession, didn't he? Not a recession. What's he actually said that's upset
right.
you?
He warned that there would be a technical recession, but that is a recession.
A technical recession isn't a recession, is it, actually?
Well, it's a technical recession.
It's a temporary recession, I think, isn't it?
All recessions have so far been temporary in the whole of history.
Well, that depends on the time scale.
A technical recession is 2/4 of GDP declining. He said that. He was completely wrong. The Treasury was worse. It said there would be between 500,000 and 800,000 jobs lost purely on a vote to leave, not actually anything happening,
and
just
the BBC?
on the vote. Dear old auntie. The BBC, how many times have we heard in spite of Brexit? In spite of Brexit, a record 3 million jobs have been created since 2010. In spite of Brexit, unemployment is its lowest level since 1975. In spite of Brexit, England defeated the West Indies at Lord's. I mean, it is again and again. And
have you? Can you actually specify an occasion when you've heard that? You say that, but have you actually? Have you got a quotation?
I've got some other quotations.
Now, have you got a quotation saying in spite of Brexit?
Well, you just have to listen to the news.
Well, that's a generalisation. Have you got a specific?
No, I think anyone who's listened to the news recently has heard the in spite of Brexit terminology, and I think the audience knows that. Well, yes, the audience seems to agree. But the Sun...
No, they're shaking their heads there.
You found one. The Sun... The Sun carried out a survey of the Andrew Marr Show.
Debate's over.
Yeah, but this is quite important because the Andrew Marr Show has had 84% of its people on being anti-Brexit. 129 interviewees against 33 in favour. That the balance of the BBC has been against. And actually, I disagree with one bit that Alex Salmond said. I think during the referendum campaign, the BBC behaved very well and tried extremely hard to be independent. It got such a shock when we voted to leave that since then I think it has behaved very badly. And I think that the situation we're in terms of the negotiations is exactly what you would expect. We have the 2-year time limit. If we hadn't exercised Article 50, the vote would simply not have been implemented. The government had to exercise Article 50, and it's now getting on with it. And of course it's an argument. That's the nature of the negotiation.
It's going to take a lifetime to fix this situation, however it goes.
It seems to me it makes it even more important that he should have been impartial.
On the economy.
This is such an opportunity. When we leave, we can set our own tariffs. Tariffs set at the European level make food, clothing and footwear more expensive. They are the highest proportion of the poorest in society's expenditure. If we can get rid of those tariffs, we help the worst off in society. That is a real benefit.
So why does your Chancellor of the Exchequer not accept this and sound so gloomy?
Because all the Treasury forecasts assume that instead of cutting tariffs on the rest of the world, we raise tariffs against the EU. That is completely insane. The Treasury's forecasts are even worse than the Bank of England.
Let's go to another subject. From Alice Moore, your question, please, Alice Moore.
Who should be held accountable for low and decreasing numbers of poor and non-white students at Oxford and Cambridge?
Who should be held responsible for we got the figures the other day, the decreasing numbers of poor and non-white students at Oxford and Cambridge? Jacob Rees Mogg.
Well, I actually agree with what the ladies just said. I think that you want to have an equality of opportunity, but that may mean that you need to help people to get that opportunity in the first place. It's worth noting on loans, student loans, they have actually led to a very large increase in the number of people going to university from the poorest decile of income. And that's quite interesting, because it's not necessarily what you would expect, but it has encouraged the poorest to go to university. I very much agree with Jermaine Greer that I think having bursaries and scholarships so that people will really be incentivised to go through university. And I think, dare I say it, that people who have had the good fortune that I've had and go to schools like Eton, where I was with your son, as I think many people know, when you've had that great advantage, it is not unreasonable for the people examining you when you get to Oxford and Cambridge to recognise that you have had every possible advantage, and somebody who hasn't had so many advantages, but who may have done less well in the exam, may actually be cleverer and more able. And I think it's perfectly fair to maintain equality of opportunity by recognising that there have been inequalities in the early
But there is a distinction, isn't there, between the number of people, the percentage of people from the lowest financial decile, economic decile, going to university, and the numbers going to Oxford and Cambridge.
That's absolutely true.
And is it important, in your view, that the entry to Oxford and Cambridge should be opening up in the same way as all the other universities?
Absolutely.
It's very important that Oxford and Cambridge maintain their world-beating standard, and therefore they should not take quotas, but what they should do is make it as easy as possible for clever people from disadvantaged backgrounds to get in. And going out to schools, and it's brilliant to hear that schools are encouraging people to apply, because certainly anecdotally once heard the reverse, and that some pupils are told, don't try for Oxford and Cambridge, it won't suit you. And that really shouldn't happen. That should be strongly discouraged. And schools should work with the universities to encourage bright people to go, not just because that's the right thing to do for the individuals, but it's also very good for the country, that if our brightest people get the best education, that is going to be very good for the country over the next generation.
Paul Pritchard, let's have a last question from you.
Should congestion charging be introduced in all cities to improve air quality?
Well, London has now introduced a congestion charge of £10 for old vehicles, old diesel vehicles and all that. And we only have 2 or 3 minutes left. Jacob Rees Mogg.
OK, in London, the congestion's worse even though there are fewer cars on the road, and that's because they've narrowed half the road so you can't get anywhere. I don't believe that government should make people's lives more difficult, and diesel is one of the real scandals of government policy of the last 20 years. As Camilla was saying, people were encouraged to buy diesels because of worries about carbon dioxide, ignoring the nitrous oxides and the particulates from diesel, which have killed people, have meant people have died younger than they should have done. This is a real scandal of public policy. And no, I don't think the answer is penalising the motorist. Most of us actually want to drive into cities, particularly if you represent a rural constituency like mine. People who want to go into Bath or Bristol, they want to drive in. It would take them all week to get a bus. They'd have to devote their whole life to plotting the bus route. They want to drive in and out, and I think politics is about making life easier for people, allowing them to do what they want to do and taking obstacles out of their way, not ordering them about how they should lead their lives. So definitely
well, I was listening to Jacob, and I was thinking that this is a man who once campaigned in a Bentley in central Fife. Luckily, there was no congesting charges.
Until next Thursday, from Question Time. Good night.